All right. Wonderful. Okay, so let's get started with our questions. So why is DevOps important to health tech? Let's see, anyone want to take that question first?
I mean, from where I come from, DevOps is the heartbeat of security and compliance. It's what automates the things. And if we can't automate it, we're going to fall behind in this space. And so we're not the only players, of course, but especially if we're doing DevSecOps together, this is a place that DevOps really belongs.
I'll add that when we talk about data and governance, that's a term that seems pretty nebulous, and it can seem almost theoretical, too theoretical to implement into real world situations, especially organizations with very complex, large amounts of data like the healthcare sector. And the way I always put data governance to people is to think of it in 3 words: automate your standards. That you need data quality standards and compliance standards. All of that is part of governance, and it's work that you're probably already doing. But if you do not find a way to integrate those standards into your development and production life cycles, there is not much purpose to them, in my opinion. And so not only creating your standards, but automating them is essential, and it's especially crucial in an area like healthcare.
That makes sense to me. And maybe one of you can share from your experience of how can we move away from the spreadsheet driving compliance exercise to automation in this space? I'll pick on Joe or Jay. Maybe Joe.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead, David, if you have an answer.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm looking at, Victoria, you and I were chatting the other day and talking about OSCAL as a possibility in the future. Today, it's not ready, right? But the idea that by using data formats, by using standards of how we write down, how security scans are coming or what our deployment status is of various things, whether our controls are in place, that can really, take us away from so much manual work to automating the compliance exercises that, especially in healthcare, we have so many regulations to work with.
Yeah, I mean, I think in DevOps, the automation of validations and security checks is kind of a key component of having a full CI/CD lifecycle and having true continuous deployment. And so, I mean, anytime you're trying to, automate software delivery, it's important. I think, to piggyback on the answers of others in the healthcare domain, it's extra important because the stakes are so high. Definitely for us at CareJourney, working in a healthcare data analytics company, I mean, the security of the data and making sure that we're only providing the data to those who are authorized to it is of paramount importance. And when it comes to HIPAA and the potential fines and reputational hit, et cetera, that comes along with any type of breach, I mean, I can't think of a better use case for automation of security and government.
Absolutely. And you're probably preaching to the choir here, like everyone at DevOps is like, of course, security is important. But I'm sure Jill in particular has experience working with founders who may not have a technology background. And how do you really convince them that security is a thing in a way that makes sense and makes them prioritize it when they're building products from the beginning?
Yeah, I think it's really hard for it to become real to people until they've had their first close call. Like the way I explain security to founders is that it's kind of like fire safety, that it really doesn't seem that important until something goes on fire, and then it's all you care about. And having your whole data set exfiltrated, which is a real threat for a lot of people, is that's the end of the company for a lot of companies. And I think automated governance is really exciting, but I also think for most organizations, particularly early founders, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. Like most people get far enough that they have, a corporate bank account, they probably have an AWS account, but then they don't know what to do from there. And the really simple things like making sure that you have single sign-on, making sure that you have a documented onboarding, offboarding procedure, and then just disabling most of the features in your AWS organization, for example, can save you from a lot of potential headaches.
Right. And, we also talk about like setting up the governance in that process around really even understanding what data you have. Like, Lauren, do you have any insights to share with how a group could set something up that can sound very like overheady and like a lot of overhead work and process, and make it easier and actually something that's accomplishable?
I do have a few tips that I talk about in the book. One of them is starting with a data framework to use to inform all of these efforts we're talking about. So, of course, security and compliance is huge. Transparency and trust is huge. Ethics is huge. And I titled the book Designing Data Governance because I am a service designer, and I do believe that data governance is a design challenge to be solved, because if you design systems, services, products with governance in mind, it becomes much easier to automate those governance standards that you set rather than having to go in and retroactively do it. I think those of us who have worked in very bureaucratic organizations, whether it's healthcare or the government, are very familiar with the high amounts of technical debt that exist in these organizations, and retroactively going in and applying DevOps. It certainly can be done. It is done every day, and it's incredibly painful for the people who have to do it. So if you're starting from scratch, I think there's a great opportunity to find a framework that already exists. I used to work for Gartner, and they have a 7-step data framework that I think is really valuable because it encompasses everything from education and training to collaboration and security. So finding a framework to start with is really important. I think it also is really essential to define what your key data domains are across the organization. So what are the key groups of data that you have, and who, if anybody, owns them today. And then the third thing to do in the first instance is to map those data domains and the use of that data in those domains back to your business strategy. Any data-driven effort really should impact the business and the organization by increasing its key goals. And I'm constantly amazed by how infrequently senior leaders can articulate those goals. If you ask a lot of them, why are you doing this migration? Why are you building this model? The answer is, well, our Oracle database is coming up on end of life, or we need, there's either some compliance or end of life reason. And sure, those are valid, but that's not enough. So I think those three things, they sound maybe simple, but that's a lot of work in and of itself, but it's worth the work that is worth investing in.
That makes sense. And it may be helpful to use like a specific example around, the API sending healthcare data back to ACOs. Maybe, I think, David, that was a question or a story you can tell us about, how do you manage that data, or what are the security concerns around that kind of data, and how do you automate some of that and figure out who the right people are that need to be involved?
Yeah, I worked on a couple of different projects at CMS that were sending, claims data to caregivers at various levels, and it depends a lot on how often these relationships change. Who is the person that is, who's my doctor? Well, I might have 5 of them. And maybe, if I'm a snowbird, I have some of them in different states, and maybe I may switch doctors, so I don't want the old doctor to be getting all my stuff. So depending on how well defined these relationships are, it can be a lot easier to deal with that. And in the best case, where healthcare information was being sent to ACOs, in my experience, even there's an awkward moment at the beginning, at the end of the year, where data has to stop flowing, and it's just not a great experience for the ACOs, for the doctors that are depending on that data. And so looking forward to see, it's just a side effect of the way that the models are put together. But it's even harder in the case of, picking direct providers. Is Dr. Smith my doctor? How can we tell? Well, Dr. Smith can say, I promise, or we could have you go in and say, yes, this is my doctor. But at some point, usability really falls down. And so the more that we can automate, and this falls in the DevOps realm, in terms of building systems, maintaining systems, making sure that they are can scale properly, and that we're not spending more money on compliance, that we aren't raising risks by getting the data out there more than we are solving actual health risks by getting that to providers. So it's a very interesting space, and I would like to see, we have healthcare exchanges in the private field that deal with similar kinds of questions, and I see this as an early phase. We have such a complicated health system in the U.S. It'd be nice in 5-10 years to have incrementally solved some of these issues that we have with sharing data, so that we really can get better care.
Yeah, well, just to dovetail on the last point you made, I agree that we're kind of in a similar place the financial industry was in prior to standardizing how they transmit financial data between the different institutions. And we're just right now, we have all these different players in the game. So wholeheartedly agree on standardization. I know that's something the industry has been trying to push towards. In terms of, it's interesting to hear your perspective from the CMS side of producing the data and pushing out the API. As a consumer of a lot of CMS data on behalf of our clients, we have an interesting use case where we want to build a bunch of analytics on top of that and then provide that back out via API, publicly accessible API in certain circumstances. And so it's a whole, I'm sure there's a lot of similar concerns and worries, but it brought along questions, sticking along the theme of security. It brought some questions that I'd never had to ask in terms of who's allowed to, some pretty basic like code-based management questions, like who should be allowed to hit the merge button on a pull request when that pull request could potentially open up a major security vulnerability, right? And so what kind of governance do I have on my code base? How many approvals do I need? What kind of validations do I need to happen in my CI/CD workflow before we promote this to production? And for us, that where most of our APIs to date have been non-PHI, aggregated data, things like that, it's a completely different ballgame and a different series of questions we're answering. And I don't think we have all the answers, but we're doing our best.
Right. And I know, Joe, you've been working on creating more standardized approach to how we build brand new software and solutions. Do you have some thoughts on how that's going and where you see the industry kind of trying to pick up some new standards?
Yeah, I mean, we spent a lot of time deploying to platform as a service offerings like Heroku, and we've done some deployments to Aptable. But what we've found is that when you start to go through stricter compliance frameworks, or you have people that have specific questions about how you handle data, you really need to know the details, like what are the cryptographic standards that are being used? Do we have unique keys for these different data sets that some of the providers can give you, but it's a journey. But then if you go in the opposite route, you decide to own your own infrastructure, deploying to AWS, it's a complete blank sheet of paper with many, many wrong answers. And for most founders, a lot of those decisions are not special to their use case. Like a lot of them don't even realize that they're going to have interesting data. They end up with data as a side effect of whatever they were there to do, like facilitate administering vaccines, but then you end up with vaccination records by law, and now suddenly you have all these data concerns. And so what we've tried to do is answer a lot of the out-of-the-box questions you have with decent, sane defaults, and build modules that we mostly use Terraform that follow some of those best practices and enable the security features by default that on a lot of platforms, even AWS, by default are off. And I think it's been going, you asked how it's been going. I think it's been going well in terms of building out the modules. It's been difficult in terms of adoption. There's a problem I've seen in DevOps that I've seen in other communities where everybody's inventing their own thing. And so like everywhere you go, you have to learn what their special approach is to how they, like everybody has their private modules. So what I was hoping to do is just make ours public and see how much engagement we got. And we have a few companies using them now, but it is an interesting challenge.
I think that's a great point, Joe, especially when you think about internet connected devices in healthcare that generate that data, because as you said, that's how you inadvertently get non-technical data stewards. You get people who are overseeing these devices in one way or another that are generating this data. And like it or not, that does become a compliance and security challenge that you have to address. And then it becomes a question of who's the best person to own and make decisions about that data. I think that's actually a great opportunity to leverage non-technical employees as possible data stewards throughout an organization. It doesn't mean that those people necessarily become DevOps engineers or that they are, but it can mean, I think, that they have an active hand in defining the data and quality standards for both that data and metadata that the products they oversee are generating. This can get very granular depending on what you're talking about, but I do think it's a really important point. Everybody talks about the IoT internet connected devices, but those the devices generate data. And then the question becomes, who owns it, who cleans it, who oversees it when it goes through pipelines? Those are all decisions that have to be made. And I think left unchecked, more data is not always better data. And again, I think everybody here knows that, but it's worth saying because I often see the volume of data, big data, being framed as a positive or as an end goal in and of itself. And it's very much not, especially in a field like healthcare. It actually can become a liability.
Right. So it sounds like if you combine those two ideas, like if you have a standardized approach for your compliance and your security and how you're building your infrastructure, then someone who maybe isn't the most advanced engineer can still own the data and know like where it goes and how it's being handled and where it's being stored. And on Terraform specifically, I wanted to ask David a little bit about threat modeling. I know he's been working on that space with his team.
Yeah, one of my coworkers had presented recently. Sometimes in the DevOps space, we're not just implementing the ideas of others. We're also, say, responsible for some security compliance, or we're driving some development. And in this case, they needed to do some threat modeling on the team. And as DevOps engineer, reaching for HCL, which is the language that Terraform uses, was a great opportunity to describe the kind of things that we're trying to, what are our assets, what are the risks against them. And there's this little tool called HCLTM that they were able to use to walk through, and it really spoke to the team of DevOps people to say, hey, this is our language. It's walking us through the things we need to do for compliance. And then it has all of the hooks that you would want in a DevOps tool to be able to programmatically do things with that data, or come back and review that. Anyway, so another one of those things where there's a lot more potential out there than there is built out for it. But there are a lot of intersects, I think, between DevOps and security, and it depends on what your team is doing, how you're going to be able to take advantage of that.
Great. That makes sense. And now, since I haven't heard from Jake in a while, what things are you doing at CareJourney to shift things left in security and put those automations in early before your team pushes code?
Great question. That's actually a big theme of this year, is shifting left across all of our work. So, what we've done is we've sat down and kind of designed out what our ideal software delivery system is, and kind of where we can push as much to the developers as possible. And so some of the things that we're actively working on right now are pre-commit hooks in our workflow that will notify the developers before they're even pushing anything up of anything they're doing that's breaking policies. We're also pushing a lot of we're trying to move to a fully artifact-driven CI/CD system. Some of our flows are, some of them aren't, but getting us as far to just generating an artifact and even having the personal developers workflows, generating that artifact that's importable, pullable by them. That's another area that we're working on. And then also, I think just kind of getting a lot more of the checks earlier in the workflow. So, obviously you still have to hold your, end-to-end synthetic tests to later on, but as much that you can push more granular checks as far earlier in the pipeline as possible. That's one of the big things that we've been working on with the devs and trying to get their workflows going. Some of the other stuff that we are doing in order to shift left, one of the big themes I've been trying to push is having the developers start really owning their own CI/CD workflows. To date, there's been a lot of, is it the DevOps engineering team who are partially integrated with the developers, but not fully? Is it their responsibility to make changes to people's workflows, their pipelines, et cetera? And so the more we can give ownership to the developers, the whole point of DevOps as a cultural mindset is that it's not any one person's responsibility to push the mentality of collaboration and automation that DevOps embodies, right? So one of the big things we're trying to make sure is this a full team effort. And just because your title might be full stack engineer or data engineer, it doesn't mean that you aren't responsible for ensuring that the projects that you collaborate on, you aren't pushing best practices and automating tests and validating all this stuff and really being responsible for that workflow and being responsible for answering questions like, why did my test break? Right? And that kind of thing. So putting more onus and responsibility on the developer to really have a full embrace of ownership of the project end to end, not just I made my commits, I made a PR, now it's done. Oh, I see there's a little checkbox on my Git screen, I'm good to go. And to people who really understand how their software delivery system works, what the checks that they do, putting ownership of formulating those checks and validations and those synthetic validations onto the developers too, right? So the more we can create these fully functional teams that own end-to-end and are getting those feedbacks as early as possible, the more we can, as we say, shift left and really let these agile teams, for those of us who do Scrum and agile teams to actually truly be agile and develop and push things out autonomously.
That makes sense. And with some confidence that they're in compliance at the same time, right? I'll go back around the other direction and see, David, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm looking at right now in my current team is use of machine learning to mine data, mine logs to correlate, hey, what is causing things to come down? It's a very DevOpsy thing, but it fits into the realm of AI. And also on the compliance side, tossing around ideas at our company about, there's so many documents that we have to generate, and so much of them, ChatGPT writes better than a lot of the security docs I've seen. So is there a way to integrate those kind of tools in a way that retains privacy, in a way that doesn't insert the kind of risks that AI brings about being sure maybe about a thing that's kind of wrong, whereas a human would be starting to get unsure as they get closer to that boundary. There may be some room for these things, and so I'm looking forward to seeing my first AI generated security doc to averting our first incident, because we were able to see into the logs with machine learning.
Oh, that sounds super cool. And I'll say, Lauren, do you want to add to that, or maybe even talk about how to shift the data governance a little bit left and bring it in earlier into your CI/CD process?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It, for me, starts with giving your development team that set of guidelines and standards early so that they are able to ideally have input into them. I think even the precursor to that is having a data governance council across your organization where each data domain, which you've predefined, has representation on that council. It, again, does not mean that everybody is necessarily a developer, a data scientist, or an engineer, but you do have people on a shared council to set standards and define what it means, for instance, to add a new term to your data catalog, what it means to review your pipelines. If your organization is large enough, you could have subcommittees, for instance, one to review all possible tools. And the earlier you get those processes integrated into your culture, I think the easier it is to then take care of the tech, because you've designed those processes and systems with data governance in mind. And you've also given everyone more transparency into how it works for your unique organization. I also think there's a great opportunity to include and embed designers into these projects. So if you have, for instance, a service designer or a product manager, their work managing roadmaps is really helpful here, because they can make a roadmap which outlines the implementation process and the pipeline process with key tasks and milestones. And I think product management and managing these like a roadmap is the most effective way to go, because your data governance, especially in healthcare, is not a project that has a conclusion. It really is a continuous life cycle. And so you need really robust processes and standards to manage that life cycle, because the work really never ends. And that can sound scary, but I think approaching it with a product mindset is a really helpful reframe for data governance.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. That thinking about what you're saying plus what David's saying, with if you're going to be developing or using AI and like really even having more data, that it'd be better to have people who have some ownership and can make some decisions about what's ethical or what's right, or are we following guidelines with all that as you go. That makes a lot of sense. Joe, do you have anything to add on that shifting security left?
I think in terms of getting everybody on board and engaged on the development team, the two things that I've found to be most helpful sound kind of contradictory, but it's to introduce decent guardrails, but then within the safe boundaries to make it very easy for people to collaborate on changes. And so, for example, talking about CI/CD, one of the things we've tried to do for our clients is have the infrastructure itself be managed by CI/CD. So rather than having people apply things in ClickOps or even running Terraform locally, you can follow the same model that developers do on their everyday code and submit pull requests for the infrastructure. And that allows you to both set up some boundaries, like things need to be reviewed. Somebody is going to look at the Terraform plan before it can get merged. You can use things like protected branches. But it also makes it possible for people to make pretty widespread changes without ever having escalated privileges on their own account. And I found that if you make it a little safer that way, if you try to increase the number of mistakes you have to make before you have broken something, it makes people more comfortable in participating and learning, and it creates more momentum on the team.
Yeah, I'll jump in and add to that quickly. In the chapter of my book on governance-driven development, there is a case study throughout the chapter on the Netflix experience of moving all of its data into brand new architecture that was very new and unproven, but it was the best fit for their needs at the time. And one of the things that the software engineering director did for his team was that he created a true space for folks to get more familiar with Kafka clusters, because that was a technology that his team was not very familiar with prior. And he knew that left unchecked, mistakes were bound to be made with very large amounts of customer data. And so he really did give his team a safe space to practice with clusters, knowing that they would make mistakes, knowing that they would fail, but he created a controlled environment for them to get comfortable with the technology in a way that did not negatively affect the user experience. And as we all know, you never want your users to know that you're doing a migration. If they do, it probably means that something went wrong. And the fact that he gave them that space to fail, I think, is unfortunately very rare, but I saw that as a really awesome example of how to truly build a data-driven culture that is DevOps centric. It's giving people the freedom to get comfortable with the technology they might not know yet.
One thing that Joe said that I'd also like to add some thoughts on is that really key to me when he was speaking was kind of the idea of giving more flexibility to the engineers to push infrastructure requests of changes, right? And so that's one of the things that, on this topic of shifting left is how do we get more responsibility to the engineers? And that's something we've been struggling with and trying to come up with a good solution for. Today we have all of our infrastructure managed in Terraform, and there's a discrete set of people who are able to actually make pull requests and actually apply changes, right? And the problem with that is, as you have more and more development teams doing all this, creating all these things, and I need an S3 bucket, I need a KMS key, I need whatever, right? The more of those you get, and then going over the wall to another team, you start having these roadblocks in your process, bottlenecks, right? And also there's just that knowledge gap. The developers don't understand anything about the actual infrastructure that things built upon, right? So we've been trying to push towards that. The problem is, you go from, I've got a single repo with, my Terraform code, and then I've got these different code bases. And so one of the things I know that I've seen the industry is really starting to lean towards, and actually, for those of you who are at reInvent, a lot of the speakers were pushing for this pretty strongly, which is to start moving. Obviously AWS is pushing for CDK because that's their new toy, but it's moving to taking some of the infrastructure code definition and moving it into the actual repository that houses the application. And so that's one area that we're working on now is finding some areas where we can say, all right, let's just take this very application specific infrastructure code, move it into this application's code base, and then allow the developers to say, I'm going to open a PR asking for this bucket. And you can still have the governance, because you can use things like code owners files and things of that nature in GitHub to enforce that certain people review changes to certain files or even a whole code base, right? So we still are able to ensure that our team that manage the infrastructure have the final say on whether a pull request is approved, but this allows the developers to get their hands on the infrastructure a little more and be able to move faster while still maintaining the government. So it's kind of a best of both worlds, and allows you to try to achieve more of the DevOps mindset of that kind of distributed responsibility. So anyway, there's just a little bit off topic, but that what you were saying about developers pushing code for the infrastructure just made me think about that.
Yeah, the point about the repository boundary is really interesting. We still keep Terraform code in a separate repository, but there is some magic change that happens for people when it's in the same Git repository they already have. Like one of the best, one of the projects we had the most developer engagement on, we had the Helm charts in the application repository. We did it initially just because of convenience, because the CI/CD we were using was not very good at coordinating multi-repository pushes. But then what we saw was we stopped getting these tickets from people like, can you set an environment variable for me? Because it was just in their repo, and they already know how to open pull requests. I think it's easy to underestimate the barrier you create just by making even another directory.
Yeah, I mean, we have a repo now that we moved. We have the Docker file, we have the Helm charts, we have the values files, we have everything in one place so that you can really define your whole deployment, and it has accelerated things, absolutely.
Well, speaking of accelerating things and making teams go faster, I wanted to bring up a question from the group in the chat about how do you measure success in this situation, and on the security side, especially. Anybody wants to jump in and pick that one up?
A soft measurement that I would toss out there is, does every single person on all of your teams feel responsible for security? Are they actively making suggestions? If so, I think you've got a healthy culture, and you are achieving success, because we're never can sit on a particular status. So I would offer that at least as one measure.
I would add to that, on the subject of security, we know that breaches from within are one of the major ways that security flaws happen in organizations, either through phishing in one way or another, or other mechanisms, it's very often the case that hackers get in through an employee. And as a result, there is now a culture in a lot of organizations of making sure that everyone is co-responsible for security. So for instance, if you fail a phishing test, which my security team at Steampunk sends out regularly, you do have to do a little training course that they've made. That hits on two areas that I think are important. You're sending automated tests and to see who falls for it, and then you are providing training, which allows people to see where they might be able to spot more sophisticated social phishing. And that's, I think, what we mean by saying you need to educate your employees. That's a great way to do it. And again, I think it's safe to say, in modern tech organizations, expect security to be a shared experience. I do think we need to move towards making data a shared experience. I still don't think writ large that most organizations are there yet, especially not in more bureaucratic organizations and industries like healthcare. So the shift towards shared security is there, even if loosely, and I think data needs to follow.
Yeah, agree with both points. I think, in the security world, especially with healthcare data, it's a constantly shifting goalposts, right? Once you get to this objective, it's like, oh, how do you get better from there? So, in terms of measurable things, obviously the highest objective is not to get hacked and not to let everything out. But, beyond that, I think it's do you have the processes and procedures in place to assess where you're at and create actionable plans for making yourself better tomorrow, the day after? And if you have that type of process in place to be able to give real assessments and actually do something about it, I think that's success in my book.
I think one important measure of success is how a team responds when something actually goes wrong. Like, mistakes are inevitable. And so, for example, if you have at least a partial security issue, does it immediately go to a full escalation? Or do you have safeguards in place that contain the damage? And then in terms of the team, how does the team react to that? Like, is there finger pointing and blaming? Do people just try to wash their hands of it? Or is there an honest discussion about how it happened? And do you have people trying to design a new system where they feel safer about not making that mistake?
Yeah, that's a great point. And it kind of leads me to my next question about building resilient teams, right? This is a very highly in demand job title, right? As a DevOps engineer, especially in health tech. And we don't want to be burning people out. And someone in the group chat also asked about just that cognitive load of having to be cross-functional and being responsible for data and responsible for security. So what are some strategies you have for building resiliency into your current teams or into your client teams?
I would say sharing the load. So that's a big benefit of data stewardship, which is the concept of data ownership in an organization. There are many benefits to data stewardship, but one of them truly is sharing the responsibility of data ownership across an organization. I think data governance is still perceived as a top-down set of rules that come from IT, and they may or may not know the intricacies of the data you work with. So a lot of times their guidance is incorrect. And the reality is that in today's world, the CTO, the CDO, the chief health officer cannot manage all of the data for their hospital or healthcare network on their own. There is too much of it, and it touches too many roles in the organization. So one of the ways I do believe you can share that cognitive load is to build a cross-functional data stewardship team, not just on the dev team, because there are cross-functional roles on that team and on your DevSecOps team in general, but then also looking at who else throughout the organization has enough literacy in data management to serve as a steward and really own that data. it takes a lot of work to create that data stewardship plan and get your council going. But once you invest that time up front, I do believe that you can ease the cognitive load on one team and one person, because again, there's too much data that exists and too much data being created each day to have one person manage it anymore. That's the fastest way to burn out.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think it was an interesting question that Randall asked in the chat, and so there's the resilience of individuals and how we make sure we have shared responsibility and structure, and then there's the resilience of the teams. And you know, I think my read of Randall's question is how does a team handle being responsible for so many different things? Because I mean, obviously, you know, the same individual is not going to be doing the infrastructure and testing, et cetera, right? But so the question is, like, on the team, how do you say, so, you know, we're all agreed with the premise that a cross-functional team that doesn't have roadblocks waiting for somebody else to do something is ideal state. But then the question is, well, okay, but now that they're asked to do all these things, you have to have speciality, understanding how to do these things. So, I mean, that's team construction. Obviously, you got to make sure you have people who have the different skill sets. When it comes to DevOps in particular, and that skill set, you know, like as I was mentioning, it's, you have to make it a full team cross-functional responsibility, to ensuring that we're all kind of rowing in the same direction. And now in terms of the more core question of like, how does this cross-functional team, let's say you build up the team, you've got somebody who's got database administration specialty, who's also a data engineer. You got a full stack, couple people who can build a web app. You got somebody who is DevOps and can help with the CI/CD. You got all the different stuff. How do you still make sure that they, as a team, handle that cognitive load? I mean, I think at that point, it's really layered responsibility structures, right? So you've got, the team has its internal responsibilities, but then you have external forces, say the data engineering manager, who's ensuring that the data engineers across multiple teams have an understanding of the right practices. And it's kind of like, it's a holistic organizational effort. So, you know, I speak to this being the person who's managing the data engineers and the DevOps engineers, and so, you know, I'm living that experience. But you know, it really takes kind of it takes a village, so to speak, to make sure that the teams have all the resources and understanding needed to be able to operate on all those different functions.
Yeah, I agree.
Add one more thing.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. So Joe, I wanted to pick up a thing that you said earlier about making sure that the team has enough flexibility to do what they need to do. I think that is relevant here as well. I think it's greatly empowering to be given a broad range of responsibility on the team. You already have to have a mental model of the stack that you're playing in. And by having that cross-functional team that's directly responsible for most of that together, it shortens the time to get answers and to develop a shared understanding of where you are and where you're going. So I just agree with Jake that that's not enough. You then need to support them with experts. But it's I think there, that tension, Randall, in your question, is something that is eased by that knowledge that you're empowered to find a solution, that you are being supported by experts if it's beyond the expertise, you know, beyond the personal experience of anybody who's on your team.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's not realistic for anybody to know the whole universe of technologies used at any company. Everything is so broad. Even just if you pick infrastructure, there's AWS, you might have Kubernetes on top of that. You have something managing the clusters, you have infrastructure as code, you have CI/CD that needs to manage itself. I think it takes a village was a good way to summarize it. One thing that I've found is very effective is, in addition to having cross-functional people that understand the grand plan, is having a culture of interaction between different specialties. So to give one example, from a recent issue, we had, this is not a security issue, but we had auto scaling set up to have dedicated containers for a GraphQL API because it was particularly intensive. And what we found is that the requests were not going to those containers. And we had two infrastructure platform engineers look at the problem for, I think, 2 days without being able to figure out how it was not getting routed to the engineers. Everything, or to the containers, everything looked correct. And finally, they set up a pairing session with one of the mobile developers. And in about 20 minutes, they found out that the URL they were sending was //GraphQL and not /GraphQL. And the application took it happily, but the routing layer saw them as different. And so like having infrastructure engineers pair with developers, having developers pair with mobile engineers, having the team interact a lot, I think is really important beyond just having the different disciplines and having the code be shared, actually have the people interact.
That makes sense. And, you know, you're kind of touching on incidents and having issues. We can move maybe into talking about site reliability, right? And that's how critical that could be to different healthcare applications. So maybe do any of you have a story about, you know, having to do with site reliability and how you kind of improved the monitoring or engagement of a site? I'll pick on you if you don't speak up. Everybody looks so thoughtful. I don't want to interrupt if you're like thinking about it in your head.
I mean, so I'll cue in. So my pensiveness was just trying to understand exactly the question, but I'll just kind of answer broadly and we'll go from there. Maybe it'll cue a conversation. I mean, obviously monitoring and observability is key for any business that's got, you know, publicly facing assets that clients would have access to. It doesn't look good when your stuff goes down, right? So, you know, I mean, I think a key thing is ensuring that you have both continuous monitoring in place, but also that you leverage that through your workflows. You know, to me, the big point, the big inflection points that cause outages are you change the code or you change the data, right? And so ensuring that you have, you know, not only do you have just a constant validation or checks in place that are doing periodic monitoring, or you're naturally validating traffic and checking all that, but then building in place mature CI/CD workflows to ensure that when changes are made, you have the right testing in place. So, you know, what does that look like? That looks like I'm pushing a new version of an API. It really depends on, there's a lot of things that go into deciding what the ideal workflow looks like. For us, we're a B2B business, and so our traffic isn't huge in terms of just native traffic. So it doesn't make sense to do something as advanced as like A/B testing or anything like that. But how do we still validate things and have a seamless deployment experience? So for those lower traffic APIs, it makes sense to say, okay, instead, why don't we just do a blue-green deployment model and deploy to the side instance, simulate a bunch of traffic with a bunch of test cases that we've generated, hit it a bunch of times, make sure that's working, but plug that through your monitoring system that you have in place. So that way you're ensuring that the same types of checks that you design for are also the ones that are being checked natively in the wild, right? So I mean, you know, I guess it's a little bit of an anecdote, but the idea is that you really both leverage your monitoring systems, both for software deployment as well as day-to-day, but also put a lot of thought into how you deploy and how you make changes and validate them and make sure that the solution matches your best use case.
Yeah, I think the most success we've had with SRE is when the measurements that engineers use for reliability are the same that people use for customer success. And so, like, giving a concrete example, we had a client that had to keep vaccination records, and they must be submitted to a central database. And so we would track the lag time between when a vaccine was administered and how long it took to be sent and received by the central database. And so by monitoring things that people actually care about, like the end users care about, you both improve the time to respond when things are really adversely affected, but also you reduce pager fatigue. Like, we don't page people for things like high database CPU utilization because you just get used to it going off and you start to ignore it. Whereas like vaccines not being submitted to a database, somebody is actually going to pay attention to if that's the kind of message they get.
Yeah, I think it's really key to define those what I call synthetic checks, right? But what is, essentially like something that's bigger than just my services returning a 500, right? So defining what those are, and the closer to Joe's point, the closer you align those to actual business use cases, the better it's going to be. Because obviously that's the kind of stuff that your clients are going to see if it breaks anyway.
I think that's a really fortunate case, Joe, that you're talking about, where the SREs are touching something that's directly applicable to the clients. One strategy I've seen that it can be useful if you don't, rather than make something up, measure how useful the SREs are being to the devs. If you've got a separate group and you're making it easier to deploy, you're making it easier to test, you're making it easier to get all the information you need as a dev. And service reliability is that's not all of what SRE is, but I think there's an overlap, and you can draw some of your measures from there at the very least, because developer precision, developer speed is certainly something that then translates into something the customer cares about.
Right. And David, I understand you work on projects where providers are actively providing care while they're using the application. And so that I'm sure you have to define certain metrics and things about reliability and security in that case. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, so to Jake had mentioned, that his company is getting information from Medicare, and then providing it, business to business to then maybe an ACO, maybe and then so that directness is filtered through somebody like Jake and his company, but you're absolutely right in that the bar is raised a lot higher when we know that the information is coming in. What if the information was on the wrong patient? What if we missed reporting on a key diagnosis or a drug that they were taking, and it messed things up? I mean, there are people that get hurt. So knowing those things makes you put as many checks and balances in as you possibly can.
Yeah, I would say David's use case, I can only imagine. I mean, being the producer that's then taken by other entities and re-aggregated and then sent back out. I mean, they're kind of the original producer, and then that's a big responsibility. So I can only imagine the strictures you put in place.
Well, I mean, follow that chain back, right? We're in healthcare. The data we're talking about are claims. Those claims came from healthcare providers that are entered with some wide range of, data. How good is that data, Lauren? Is part of what Lauren's been talking about, and you can't always depend on that. And the more people touch it, the more systems that touch it, the more room there is to get that out of whack. Even into the best, with the best motives of cleaning it up.
I read an article once talking about this, about the many challenges with the US healthcare system, and one of them is the lack of a centralized database. You think about, the National Health Service in England, for instance, in the UK, and they have a centralized repository by virtue of being a singular health service. Of course, there is also private healthcare in the UK, but by and large, there is a centralized resource that people can use for patient data. And because healthcare is so fragmented in the US, that creates enormous challenges when you're talking about data and data governance, because forming a data governance council across US healthcare is, I hate to say it's impossible. I don't see how it's possible given the nature of how disparate the data is. And so that is an enormous challenge that we need to solve, but at bare minimum, we need to be aware of. I hadn't ever heard it framed that way when it came to healthcare data, and how that lack of a centralized repository is such a challenge, but it really results in to put it kindly, a negative user experience, a negative patient experience, and the consequences can be very, very negative.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's hopefully bringing up all kinds of topics and ideas in the healthcare space. Because when we talk about, health tech, that's a huge range of what, everything from devices to web applications to backend data health records. Oh, and let's see, we got a question from the audience. So is the FIHR standard an attempt to centralize or at least make data more easily exchanged? I believe our panelists are familiar.
I can fill that. I'm relatively familiar with FHIR. Yes, that is the idea behind it is to create a singular protocol for delivering the healthcare data. So for those who aren't familiar, actually, I need to remind myself what FHIR stands for. It's the fast healthcare interoperability resource, right? So essentially, it's a standard defining how you define a JSON object that details a claim. Really, that's the end of the day. And today we have all these different electronic health record companies that have different formats, and so that's the big problem we have today. Is one company uses this one field, the other one doesn't, and they kind of get thrown into a catch-all by organizations like CMS. It's a bit of a big Wild West out there, right? And so, I mean, FHIR's very interesting. We've played around with some use cases for it. There's a couple of reasons that you'd want to get into it in healthcare. One is if you want to start consuming more current data. If you're looking at something like what CMS provides, like CCLF or claim and claim line feed, that those are monthly files. A lot of the cadence is monthly. In FHIR, there's a lot of different ways to whether it's like through Blue Button or other programs to get much more current data through FHIR. So that is, so long story short, that is the attempt. I think that there hasn't been as much adoption as they, I think, wanted a few years ago. Part of it is, it's a very verbose language. And so when you start thinking about transmitting lots and lots of data, the verbosity can run to create issues for use cases. It just, you kind of have to, it's going from comma delimited data sets to a bunch of JSON, right? So, you can just imagine the kind of refactors that systems would have to do in order to process and do something with that data. And so I think that's been the big elephant in the room that kept things slow so far.
I want to add one thing to that. As somebody who's worked with the government on helping create, a little substandard there in FHIR, there are so many different use cases for the data. FHIR does a great job of being able to let you specify, okay, we're going to have this data set, you can have multiple copies of it. These are the possible values. We can inherit from these other things. There are a lot of groups doing a lot of work saying, okay, in our section of the industry, these are the problems that we need to solve. And it's very active. But at the end of the day, any given pair of organizations sharing the data are going to have to agree on a lot of things, because there are a lot of decisions left, by the standard to the individual implementation.
I think another challenge is the quality of data as a consumer. Even with the standard, there are many dialects. And what I found is, I've been on both sides producing data and consuming data. So most people producing it are trying to solve a very specific use case, and they're not particularly interested in all the different things the standard has to offer. And so, for example, they might develop a system that emits records about patients being admitted, but then doesn't do anything else. And so if you have that as part of your ingestion pipeline, you have all these weird things where it's like, well, this person appeared in a hospital and then appeared in a different hospital 2 years later, but there's no record of what happened in between. And so even though FHIR does standardize some of the way we put things into the JSON, there are still many different ways to put strings in those JSON files that can have interesting consequences.
Yeah, I think that part of the reason it got designed that way is just because there were so many use cases being supported that we had to create kind of a very, I think David probably could shed more light on this than I can, but a very flexible standard. But the problem is once you create that Swiss Army knife, then you got to support all those different pieces, right?
That makes a lot of sense. And I want to give our audience a chance to ask some questions. So if you want to put your question in the chat here, we'll do that before we have about a little bit less than 20 minutes left. So any questions, or if any of our panelists have a question for someone else on the panel, you're also invited to ask questions.
I have a question in terms of data governance and ownership. One problem that I've seen a couple times now is in creating metrics for reliability about the application, we accidentally or incidentally create more data that then needs to be governed. And it's like, we don't do it intentionally. So for example, we might measure the time it takes to do a certain thing, but then as a byproduct, you're actually recording, for example, how long an appointment takes. And that becomes meaningful data that you have to care about. So I guess my question is, how do you manage that emergent data? How do you manage ownership of that?
I would say it's complicated, but I do think the first step is to recognize that you cannot separate data quality from any of these conversations about ownership, metadata, things of that nature. And that might sound really obvious to folks on this call, but I think it's worth reinforcing because I literally today had a conversation with someone in a stakeholder role who was trying to say to our data architect, when the data architect showed him the quality standards and how we wanted to automate that throughout their pipeline, this stakeholder said, I don't understand why you're accounting for data quality in this diagram. I want to see how you're going to manage metadata, and I want to see how you're going to manage data quality in a separate chart. And that the entire concept of those being two separate endeavors is a huge problem. So I think going back to your question about what do you do when you create new data, it starts, I think, by recognizing that data quality is not a separate output or goal to any of this. It has to be at the forefront, and you have to account for data quality in all of your pipelines and diagrams. You have to design for it at the outset. The other thing is to ask yourself which data is really important and set up mechanisms for data destruction. I think, especially in healthcare, hanging on to any and all data is not just a security risk and a liability. It's really expensive. If you're housing all of that data in the cloud or in data centers, you are spending a lot of money for data that you probably don't use 90% of. So if you inadvertently create more data, it's not necessarily that you have to govern it at all. I think you have to ask yourself, is this useful? If so, which business use cases does it serve? Who is already owning the data in that domain, and who would be the best person to take it? If it's noise, it probably is better to try to destroy it. And I will say getting into that habit of having data destruction is also important because the volume of data is so high.
Yeah, I definitely agree that creating automation of like log rotation, lifecycle policies on things where it's data that you don't need to keep, you have no requirement to keep it over a certain period of time. It's always great to clean it up. To Joe's point about what happens when you're creating data, maybe in a more general sense, what happens when you're creating data, whether it's metadata or data that's being generated by the application, whatever the use case, what about when you're creating data that creates more governance? I mean, I think that's just the way of the world, especially actually with metadata, right? Especially, with the kind of the designing metadata-driven applications where so much of the functionality is driven by what's actually in the database.
having those types of and realizing that's a very powerful thing. Now it's like now it's not just gating my code, but also making sure that I'm putting gates and structure on how I version the actual data itself and how it gets protected, and ensure that, you know, only the right processes can update it. And when it comes to logging, you know, sometimes the logs might have sensitive things in it, or to Joe's point, you might be calculating certain things that actually fall under certain standards for what becomes personally identifiable health information, right? Yeah, it's as part of one of the use cases we've been working on is looking at ways to de-identify data that we are producing. And so I've learned so much about all the intricacies of what can be considered, you know, something that you could use to reverse calculate identity of someone, right? And so you know, you do have to be really careful about the stuff that your applications are producing, that you might not inadvertently create PHI, right? And all the obligations that come alongside of it.
That was actually my question. I was going to ask if anybody on this call had experience with PII, personally identifiable information in healthcare, and how you manage that throughout the DevSecOps pipeline and lifecycle, either masking it or in some cases unmasking it. The nuances of that, especially when it comes to healthcare, I would be curious to hear how folks on this call, on the panel, or in the audience have handled that before in healthcare.
One use case that goes that you may not be talking about, but you remind me of the importance of having test data and not using de-identified data as test data. It's really hard to get realistic test data. Does it actually have all the different healthcare outcomes that you might expect? You know, is it consistent for a given individual across their time? You know, what do your users care about? If they care that deeply about it, it can be expensive and hard to do, but it's worth doing because, you know, like Jake was pointing out, that you can't you know, reverse engineer it because it's absolutely been created from scratch.
Yeah, wholeheartedly. I mean, it's creating a representative data set from scratch that is stratified across all of the different, you know, different slices of the data. It's very, very challenging if you're not doing the de-identification route. Yeah, Lauren, you know, my company's bread and butter is taking PHI and processing it and producing it back out either in PHI form or not. That's what we do. So I mean, yeah, I mean, we have a lot of different processes we have to put in place to protect that data. We have network access policies as well as database level policies. Obviously, you know, it's layers of protections. We have a lot of data governance in terms of how we promote data sets to either to production, but also to be sent to customers, and a lot of automation of validations to make sure that the correct data is being propagated for the right client, et cetera, et cetera. And then we've had to do things like take our different types of data. And I think, Lauren, you actually mentioned earlier talking about figuring out your data use cases. And you know, we've had to do that and really segment. Let's put the PII, the PHI data in place in one instance of data that has all the highest security. And we have special networking policies for access to that, special everything. And then the data that's not as secure, we can put in a different place with maybe less restrictive policies for access. And so then you have your database level permissions, but then you also have just networking based, like I can't even get to the database, right? And so having those different layers of protection, having the different layers of governance for how you provision access, putting as much automation in place. You know, one of the early things we did once we really started is we built kind of a custom SCIM implementation, so a custom application that will provision access to all of our different services and accounts. And there we have a centrally managed place to provision access to all of our systems, right? So that's the kind of thing you have to do when you start into the I'm housing and distributing PII game.
Yeah, I think in terms of DevOps, one big win is to make sure that all of the data changes and queries go through the pipeline. So like developers get used to having production access and doing quick checks directly on the data. And people build a skill set of debugging using production consoles. And so you have to build a separate process for doing that, where people learn how to submit pull requests that run jobs that will record something about the data. And that way, somebody gets to review it before it runs, and you make sure like, oh, actually that's going to create new PII that we have to care about, or actually nobody should be seeing that. So having everything go through DevOps and through the CI/CD pipeline. And I think the other thing that's really helpful is if you assume that at some point people are going to be accessing the data, is making sure that you have audit logs of everything. Because if you can't prevent people from accessing the data, you can at least see what happened and recreate the events after the effect.
Oh, that's great. And thank you all for your input and for being on the panel. We're kind of coming to the end of our time here. So I'd like to go back around and get final takeaways from everyone. And if you could start off with your name and title, since I didn't hit the record in time, so we'll have that on the video, that would be great. Let's see. Who am I going to pick? Who lives closest to the center of DC? I think it's probably Lauren.
I think it's me. Yeah.
Anyone else in DC proper? Okay, you go ahead. You go first then, Lauren, to wrap us up.
All right. So I'm a service designer at Steampunk, and I'm also the author of a book called Designing Data Governance from the Ground Up. And I would say in the context of healthcare data, it's really essential to start by knowing where your data lives. That's another big challenge for large bureaucratic organizations. I know if we've worked with clients in these organizations, it can feel impossible to get answers on, does stuff originate in a CSV on someone random person's computer? Is it in an on-premise server? Is it in AWS? We don't know. And taking the time to really document not only what data you have, but where it lives is super essential, especially as it relates to healthcare.
Right. I'm just going to go reverse clockwise now. So I'll go with Jake next.
I'm right by the DC border, so you might have gotten the right. Yeah, so I'm Jake Selby. I'm the Vice President of Engineering at CareJourney. Yeah, I guess takeaways. Look, I mean, this stuff is hard. It's even harder when you have the stakes of healthcare. So I think the big things that I think I've heard everybody kind of preaching is enabling developers, making sure that we shift things left, making sure we give more knowledge to our teams, but we also, at the same time that we give more responsibilities and more power to all the engineers, we also have to put in place a lot of very strong governance programs and a lot of that kind of top-down different procedures and processes, and put those in place to ensure that while you're giving them more flexibility and allowing people to move faster, you're also validating that they're doing things the right way and that you're maintaining security. And you do that with the process and procedure, but you also do that with the automation of validations and checks and what have you. So automate, empower, trust but verify.
Great. Thank you, Jake. David, do you want to go next?
Sure. My name is David Greene. I am a principal engineer contracting for Medicaid at the moment on a data warehouse. And these, just to conclude, I would say that, DevOps is the thing, while our topic is about compliance and security, we often think about compliance and security as things that stand in the way of getting things done. But DevOps, in the automation it brings and the checks and balances it gives, I think can really overcome that things faster. And so I think if you work together, you're designing, you look at compliance not so much creatively as holistically. Lauren, you've been talking about service design. It's important to think about these, everything that you're doing within a larger framework. But I think there's so much potential in DevOps to make security and compliance something that you are, you're relieved about and is actually helping you go faster.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. Appreciate that. And then Joe, not last but not least. Finish up.
I'm Joe Ferris. I'm the CTO and a developer at thoughtbot. I'm in the Boston area, so I'm within train distance of DC. I think my big takeaway is that creating a culture of enablement and group ownership of practices, but also of mistakes and of processes is really essential to having any kind of security culture. That if people can't talk about it, or if people are afraid to try and change something, then it's not going to go well.
That's a great point to end on, and a topic we always bring up at DevOps DC as well is that it's not just automation or a set of fancy tools, it's also the culture, and that's how you build really resilient teams. So thank you all so much for coming here and spending